this is the iPhone Air. And when you compare it to this, the base iPhone 17, this thing has shorter battery life, less cameras, and it's $200 more expensive. Now sure, it does have a bigger screen, and it is unbelievably sleek. But no matter how you slice it up, that value proposition just doesn't make a lot of sense. At least on paper. That is until you pick it up and you hold it. And you instantly get a sense that this device represents more than just a simple quest for thinness. The iPhone Air is a device with a mission: to push Apple's design and engineering further than it's ever gone before, and potentially down the line, it might hold the foundation for something even more radical in the future. Now, on a super practical level, you could view the iPhone Air as simply a replacement to the old iPhone 16 Plus because there is no iPhone 17 Plus model. That's what this is, basically, more or less. But that's really selling it short because, as we've seen with Samsung earlier this year when they introduced the Galaxy S25 Edge, there's more to this phone than just being super thin. The iPhone Air represents a new era for Apple's smartphone development. But on top of that, not only is the iPhone Air skinnier than the S25 just by a tiny bit, this represents the best of what I like to call that kind of sci-fi space pebble look. It is unbelievably well crafted. You have really nice rounded corners, and unlike the Edge, which is a little bit too sharp for my taste, Apple has beautifully polished the edges. Now, it's not technically the lightest iPhone ever made. If you remember the iPhone 5C, that was actually much lighter. But at 165 grams, this thing basically disappears into your pocket and you forget it's there. At 5.6 millimeters, it is actually the thinnest iPhone to date. All told, this is a proper marvel of engineering. And it's not just the exterior design too. That's an ethos that Apple carries throughout the entire device. Now, despite its dimensions, this thing isn't all sleekness and no strength. Around the edge, you have a titanium frame, and it might not seem like that because it's polished instead of that kind of matte texture that we've seen on a lot of other titanium-based devices. You also get a full IP68 rating for dust and water resistance, so you don't have to worry about dirt or spills kind of messing with your phone. And then in front, you get a new ceramic Shield 2 panel, which not only is much more scratch resistant, it also has an anti-reflective coating. Now, if you look closely, it doesn't completely eliminate glare, but it does do a really good job at knocking down some of those really bright, distracting highlights, which is kind of all I'm really asking for. Now, as for the display itself, there's not much to complain about here. The Air screen has a peak brightness of 3000 nits, and it has ProMotion support, so it can change its refresh rate from 1 to 120 Hz depending on the content. That's also really good for power efficiency, which we'll get to a little bit later. But the real impact is that when you take a display this good and put it in a device this thin, this is like one of the best examples of that idea of taking a magazine page and putting it onto a device, and then you get to hold it in your hands, and it just looks uncanny sometimes, and I honestly can't get enough. That said, I do appreciate how Apple still found room for your traditional camera buttons. You get that action button and a flush-mounted camera key, so you have really fast access to your photo and videos when you need it. And if you look closely, I do appreciate how this subtle slope up to the camera plateau. Now, I don't really love that name, but there is a really nice, subtle, sophisticated slope up, and this is Apple's engineering and design at its best. That's pretty clear. Now, the one big issue I have with the phone is that it only has a single mono speaker up here in the earpiece. And even though this single speaker is pretty loud and punchy, with stereo speakers have been pretty much standard equipment on premium smartphones for the last handful of years, going back to a mono speaker just doesn't sound right. The other potential issue, and I will admit, it is the most minor of nitpicks, is that this USB-C port on bottom isn't 100% centered. It's a little lopsided. But that said, Apple says to make this phone this thin, they had to 3D print this USB-C port out of titanium, which is the first time Apple has ever done that. So I'm gonna give them a pass on that lopsided connector. Now, as for performance, compared to the base iPhone 17, the Air has a more powerful A19 Pro chip. However, unlike the silicon available in the full iPhone 17 Pro line, the Air's processor has 1 fewer GPU cores, 5 instead of 6. That's it, even with that shortfall, the phone was never hurting for speed. Flipping between apps is pretty much instantaneous, as you'd expect on a phone this expensive. But I gotta say, thanks to the new liquid glass design in iOS 26, the home screen and all the settings menus in the iPhone have never looked better. And if we step up to more intense tasks like gaming, that didn't do much to slow the phone down either. Frame rates remained really stable in titles like Destiny Rising, with more casual fare like Sword of Convallaria looking effortlessly fluid. The only time the phone seemed mildly taxed was when using tools like Apple's Image Playground, and that's mostly because the back of the phone would get a little warm. Now that said, you do have to watch out because if you do any of these more intensive tasks for a long period of time, the phone does heat up because it doesn't have a vapor chamber like the iPhone 17 Pro line. And I actually noticed that the hottest part on the phone is actually up here on the camera plateau, which was a bit surprising to me. But in my experience, it never got too hot to touch, so it's not really that big of a deal. The downside is that Apple's new C1X modem inside the iPhone Air doesn't support millimeter wave 5G. Now, that might not be a big deal depending on where you live and what carrier you're on, but if you're the type of person who demands peak mobile data speeds, that is something to consider before upgrading. Now, moving on to the camera. The photos and the videos that the iPhone Air takes are excellent, but at the end of the day, there still isn't a real replacement for more lenses, so all you have is a single 48 megapixel main camera. Obviously, that is a bit limited. Now, as for image quality, the iPhone Air is excellent. In a shot of some homemade cookies that my wife baked, details were sharp and colors were so rich that my mouth is still watering even though I ate them yesterday. Same goes for a tricky photo at sunset, where the Air managed to capture the warmth and subtle tones of the day's fading light. And at night, it kept pace or even slightly outshot some of its biggest rivals, including the Pixel 10 Pro and the Samsung Galaxy S25 Edge, like in my image of a local mural and some flowers in low light. That said, if you're the kind of person who loves a good telephoto shot or the extra field of view you get with an ultra-wide lens, the Air's 2x optical quality zoom just means you're kind of out of luck. Now, impressively, despite only having a single lens, the Air still manages to take a really good portrait-style pic. In fact, Apple says that it re-engineered the iPhone Air's photo pipeline because normally you do need those two cameras to get a better sense of depth. But by relying on a single camera and the improved processing inside Apple's new silicon, the iPhone Air can basically match exactly what you get from the iPhone 17. Now, if you do some pixel peeping, you will notice that little elements, especially stuff like flyaway hairs, might not look quite as sharp as you would expect from a dual camera phone, but you basically have to do a side-by-side comparison to really notice those little differences. Meanwhile, in front, Apple's new center stage feature and the Air's 18 megapixel selfie camera might be the next big photo revolution that a lot of other smartphone makers are going to be copying real soon. By using a square sensor instead of a rectangular one, you can switch between portrait-style shots and landscape orientation photos with a touch of a button. Or actually, the phone can even switch automatically depending on if it senses a bunch of people right next to you during a selfie, and it'll automatically switch to a wider landscape mood for group photos, which is really nice. Now, for me, I don't love selfies, so usually when I'm taking a selfie, I want it to be in front of a big landscape, and I want to capture a really big field of view and that vista behind me. So being able to just touch a button and switch to landscape mode so I get that wider field of view is just really nice. And it means I don't have to go like this or like this and kind of contour my arm, which always just feels and looks a little weird. Because this phone is so thin, you might think battery life would be an issue, but in my experience, it has not been at all. Now, officially, Apple doesn't provide specs for the size of the power cells in its devices, though the company does state that the Air should provide 27 hours of continuous video playback, which is really only 3 less hours than what you get from a standard iPhone 17. That's a drop of just 10%, and considering the Air's design, that's a trade-off I'm happy to make. My results pretty much line up with Apple's numbers. In a streaming video rundown test over Wi-Fi, the iPhone Air lasted 23 hours and 39 minutes, barely an hour less than what I got from a base iPhone 17 at 24:45. And in the real world, the Air fared even better than expected. Even on a day with over 7 hours of screen on time, which includes running benchmarks and gaming, the phone had 25% juice left in the tank at the end of the day. That's pretty good. And on later days when I wasn't working or constantly checking my phone, I often had 40 to 45% battery left. And when it comes to recharging, the Air keeps things very simple. All you need is a 30-minute charge, either wired or wirelessly, to add about 50% battery back to the phone. Now, I don't normally talk about accessories when I review phones, especially because I'm not a fan of cases. That said, I'd never disparage anyone for wanting to add some extra protection to their $1,000 device. However, I'd argue that the iPhone Air's best companion is this: Apple's MagSafe battery pack. It's just so easy to use. You slap it on the back and it's already charging. And when you want to recharge it, you can just charge the iPhone and it will pass through juice to the battery pack, so it's just less things to manage. But the really cool thing is that if you want to charge the AirPods Pro 3 wirelessly, the MagSafe battery pack can do that too. You just slap it on back and there you go. So you have a super easy way to charge your phone and your AirPods without needing to worry about wires. And if I was an iPhone fanatic and I wanted to travel super light and only keep the bare essentials on me, these are the 3 things that I would pack. While the iPhone Air's thinness may be its most striking quality, it's abundantly clear that the handset is so much more than just that. Not only does this device represent a radical evolution of Apple's smartphone design chops, it forced the company's engineers to come up with more power-efficient solutions to make all of this possible in such a thin chassis. And in that respect, I think the iPhone Air is a massive success. Now, one interesting wrinkle in all of this is that the true potential of the Air might not be truly felt for another year or two. That's because while Apple might not want to say so just yet, if we look to what happened with the Galaxy S25 Edge and how that design translated almost directly into the Galaxy Z Fold 7, with the iPhone Air, I think it's pretty clear, and I'm willing to bet that this device, Apple is laying the groundwork for a future foldable iPhone. But we're gonna have to wait to see if that becomes a reality. Now, I totally understand that for fans of previous Plus model iPhones, the iPhone Air's increased price, smaller screen, and single rear camera certainly aren't ideal. But for those who appreciate a powerful but still effervescently portable mobile companion, the iPhone Air feels like it's in another stratosphere.